It's an honor to be here again with you, and we will have an interesting discussion, of course, with bright minds that I'd like to introduce for our panel guests. First, I'd like to welcome the Minister for Federal, European, International Affairs and Media of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, just in case, and as a reminder, the state we're currently in. Please welcome Nathanael Liminski. Our next guest is the Chief Executive Officer at Lupa, a digital native platform that combats misinformation through journalism and media literacy in Brazil. Welcome, Natália Leal. From Bangladesh, she is a reporter with the Daily Star, the largest circulating English-language newspaper in the country, where she specializes on topics like abuse of power, inequality, and state-backed corruption. Welcome, Zyma Islam. Please take a seat. And last but not least, he is the editor-at-large of The Bulwark, a news network dedicated to providing political analysis in the US, and also founding director at Defending Democracy Together, an organization fighting for democratic principles in the United States. Welcome, William Kristol. You may sit here if you want. This way, please. And as you already know, because you are now experienced visitors of the Global Media Forum this year, we would like you to participate by answering a question that we will, of course, take a look into before our Q&A. So I would now like to introduce the question that we have prepared for you. And it is, have you lost parts of your audience or audiences to news fatigue in the last year? The options are many, some, none, or I don't know. So please feel free to scan the QR code or already log into the platform, answer the question, and we will take the look at the results further ahead. Let's now start our discussion. I'd like to start with you, Minister Liminski. Journalism here in Germany still enjoys a comparably high level of credibility. How would you assess how journalists are perceived in this country right now and how that has developed?
Well, there are studies about that. A very recent study says that 43% of all Germans trust in the media. This is overall a good rate. I'd say I wouldn't overestimate it, but also I wouldn't overvalue it. It's pretty much the same level than like before the coronavirus time. So the pandemics. So although we had a debate about media and in its role in the pandemics, it's pretty much the same level by now. But I think we all have to fight for trustworthy media. And for me as a minister, this means to create circumstances in which media also can survive as a business. It's very important to me that it's not just the public broadcasting system. Of course, the public broadcasting system in Germany is important, but we also have a quite loud debate about quality in the public broadcasting system as well. Just now we are reflecting among the states about what to do in order to keep up the acceptance for a system which is financed by not by donations, not by business, but also by all the citizens in our country. So we have to work for that, and of course, also in politics we play a role. For example, in how we talk about media and how we behave towards media. So it's a great responsibility, a huge responsibility, but there will be no democracy without free media. So to me, it's a core issue, not just because I'm a son of a journalist.
All right, but that's a good starting point. You were talking about how important it is how politicians talk about media. And I'd like to bring in Natália now. It's a very different picture in Brazil, where we've seen large confrontations between governments and the media. What needs to happen, or how do we get to a point where trust in journalism is so severely damaged?
Thank you, Javier. Thank you all for having me. I would like to thank you, DW, for the invitation and all of you who are with us until now. Well, Brazil, it's a very complicated country. We had some attacks against journalists, but also against other two pillars of democracy, our electoral system and our justice system. So it's the combination of these three levels of attack that leads us to the scenario that we have now. So in Brazil, more than 40% of people don't believe in news, avoid news, and this is increasing since the pandemic. And I don't see this, getting better in the short-term period. So I don't want to sound pessimist, but yeah, we have some problems that we need to deal with, and the business model of journalism is in the center of this problem, but also the regulation of the platforms, the big techs, they need to respond to their responsibility in this scenario, and they need to help us to better understand and to make this landscape better for news and for journalistic initiatives.
We're going to briefly stay in the diagnosis mode. Of course, we want to share solutions. We want to get there. Zyma, Brazil ranks 82 in the World Press Freedom Index. Bangladesh, 165. What's the situation like for you, and how is it with trust in journalists in Bangladesh?
Thank you for the question. There are several hundreds of newspapers in Bangladesh. There are 49 television channels. You would be hard-pressed to find one or two which are independent. I belong to an independent media organization, but mine is really a rare breed. And that shows what kind of news is being put out there and who are the ones putting out the news. So if you don't know, for the last 16 years, Bangladesh has had a single political party ruling the government over and over again. We have absolutely decimated our opposition. We don't really have a viable political opposition anymore, very similar to what Natália was saying. And right now, what that means is that if you want to do good in Bangladesh, you have to be friendly with the ruling party. And that also applies to media conglomerates, which are owned by businessmen, which are owned by oligarchs who have seats in the parliament. They are not going to be holding accountable the powers that be. And which is why, if you, for example, go to any of my news articles and you go to the comments section, you would be finding that a significant amount of people disbelieve me. I will be presenting them with facts, with documents. I have a rule. I do not report anything that is not supported by a written piece of paper, and I still get disbelieved all the time. I'm either getting paid by someone, I am a foreign spy of some sort. The level of distrust in media is alarmingly high, and it's dangerous for journalists.
A situation that can also be reflected to a certain extent in the United States. It was a US president who arguably made the term fake news a mainstream expression. William or Bill, in such a divided environment, can you even be a journalist in the United States these days without having half the country against you?
It's a good question. Maybe more than half the country against you if you do your job well. Well, first of all, let me just say thank you to DW for having me here, and it's great to be back in Bonn. I think the only time I was here, I've been elsewhere in Germany many times, was in 1991 when I was Vice President Quayle's Chief of Staff in the George H.W. Bush administration, and we came here to Bonn to meet with Chancellor Kohl, a very memorable meeting, and I guess we met in his residence or his office, which I think is nearby, right? Yes. It was nearby. But we met, I remember coming to this building, and I guess this very chamber, right, to meet with deputies, CDU, and opposition, SPD, and maybe there were a few Greens then, I'm not sure, in 1991, fewer than today. So it was a moving visit, you know, to come here in June of 91. And it's related to freedom and to freedom of the press, right? I mean, it was those were very hopeful days and very, as I say, very exciting to be a tiny little part of it on my part. And the US played obviously an important role, as did the Chancellor and everyone here in Germany. No, it's very bad that the US, I mean, the mayor discussed the basic law here, but you know, the U.S. I think was always an anchor to some degree. We maybe overstated it in the U.S., but still, for the basic freedoms and for defending them and to some degree promoting them elsewhere in the world for the last 80 years rather. And it's not reliably the case now. I mean, I think that's a very worrisome thing. I don't like it as a citizen of the United States, but honestly, it's not good for the world if the United States is itself to some degree part of the problem, not part of the solution. And I think we've seen that, unfortunately, in the last several years. So I have no easy reassurance to give. I think, you know, this infrastructure, so to speak, of democracy, of freedom, civil society in the US remains very strong. So we have the big advantage of 2 centuries of this, more or less, not just a few decades or a few decades interrupted by other decades, as in the case with other countries. It's not we take great pride, I'll just say one thing, we take great pride in this. Of course, it's not really anything we did, right? It's lucky that generations before us created this, so to speak, infrastructure and traditions which we can live off. But I can't say honestly that today we're doing a very good job of sustaining them.
So the distrust is definitely there across the board, if you will. We have to talk about what we do now. How can we deal with that? Now, Zyma, you have a strong brand behind you, as the Daily Star is a well-established outlet in Bangladesh. Do you think that's, first, enough just to have a strong brand behind you, and should that be a priority to just ensure that the brand is kept and strengthened?
The brand can only be kept if you are working at it. So this is not a brand that can be bought, and trust cannot be bought. The way we do it really is with spitting investigative journalism, and that's something that we truly do focus on. It's not easy. We cannot do it all the time, but every time we do investigative journalism, it brings our audiences back. Wherever they have strayed, they come back right to the brand, right to where we want them. And it's dangerous. We end up in courts. We get calls from government agencies. We get threats. I wish I could share some of the stories, but honestly, even that would be too dangerous for me to share. But I can tell you about a very recent story of ours that actually ended up all the way to the Supreme Court, and it had to be dealt with by the Chief Justice himself. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes a lot of legal support, and we still do it because we know that this is what we are meant to do, and we have that responsibility for doing it.
Can it be a risk in itself, though, because you also, with that, in a certain way, diminish trust in the politics, in the politicians, when you reveal corruption, for instance? Doesn't that create a sort of spiral? Could we consider that as a potential risk? When you say we go hard on the government and their responsibilities, could that even deepen that distrust from the other side, from supporters of the government, for example?
Yes, but we are, right now, my organization and a few others, we're the only ones really holding them accountable. So even if we are somehow diminishing trust in, say, a certain political party, we are not necessarily diminishing trust in politics as a whole. What we are doing is we are reviving people's political sensibilities, because what happens is people get disengaged from politics. Our voter turnouts in the last elections was really at its lowest. We had like about the government is saying it was 40%, and we think it's even lower. That is an extremely low amount of people turning up to vote for a government that's going to be staying in power for the next 4 years. That's not even a majority that's voting. So what we are trying to do is we're getting people to get more engaged in politics. This is your country, and you need to take charge.
There is this fine line, Bill, I also would like to ask you, between knowing that there's an audience that distrusts you, simply, and doing your job, which is supposed to regain that trust, and that's what we're going to talk about. To what extent does simply working for a certain media organization become a liability, where you just get signed off as, you are Fox News, for example, or you are CNN, and therefore you're only going to tell me a certain perspective?
I mean, obviously that happens. I wouldn't obsess too much about trust. Some distrust of the media is not such a bad thing. I'm old enough to remember the Vietnam War, and the media probably did a very bad job of educating the American public. They went along with the government much more than they should. Now, they then exposed Watergate, and so they had sort of a very good few years of public relations in the US after that. But the media, there's always been a healthy, I very much agree with your comments. I mean, we need a healthy distrust of politicians. We need a healthy distrust of the media. The trouble is when it spirals out of control, and when it spirals out of control in a way that you simply get a kind of tribalism where people believe their own side. The problem isn't distrust today. The problem in some ways is people have too much trust in bad media. I would be fine in the US if people looked at everything that was on social media and looked at Fox News and MSNBC, which is the liberal equivalent, you might say. A little unfair to MSNBC, but whatever. They're the two poles in cable news. If everyone looked at both of them skeptically with some distrust, that would be healthier.
And there is some distrust that can or cannot be healthy also here in Germany. Minister Liminski, we have a strong public media system that you already mentioned, but you also mentioned the necessity to look into that. There are, however, political parties, for instance, that are severely questioning the necessity of the public media, and taxpayers actually also funding them. What, in your view, can be done to strengthen the position of public and also private outlets specifically?
First of all, I would like to agree to the point that a certain distrust or skepticism is healthy, or even it's needed towards politics as well as towards media. For example, if you look into the internet, very many new media, you have to be mistrusting, at least in the beginning, in order to see if they are trustworthy or not. But after that, of course, we have to find a regulation in order to distinguish between media you can trust in and media you cannot trust in. And that's why we have treaties in Germany where we have certain criteria which you have to have fulfilled in order to get a license, for example, or to be allowed to offer your program. If it's on a regular basis. Of course, there are many media besides, as the internet gives the possibility. But to me, it's very important that we enforce those treaties and that we really do what we can do in order to show what's trustworthy and what's not. But in the end, it's the user who has to decide it. It's not the state or not politics who can decide. So we have to look at the other side as well of the media system to enable users to distinguish between fake news and trustworthy news, between those things which are biased and those things which are trying to be neutral. There is no total neutrality or objectivity in media, but at least some media try to be and others don't even try. So, and in order to do so, we as a state government, as we are in charge of media policy, we have started to do more than just create conditions for media businesses and for the public broadcasting system. We also have created programs in order to help people to look what their abilities are when it comes to media competence, when it comes to media literacy. And we see that millions of people try to do so. It's a homepage or a website, and you can do it on in your home. and you can see what you are already good in, and where you have things to learn still, and then you can find offers, not just public programs, not just public organizations, but also private, private things which you can visit or go to in order to learn how to handle a situation where we are flooded with information, and where in the end it's the user who decides whom he trusts in or not.
It is definitely a question of the audiences. Maybe there's also a problem with the audiences. Natalia, you dedicate yourself to, in a certain way, ensuring that people know what's true and what's not. But what about the value of truth? Because this has also been an ongoing discussion, and every time we see these developments and this distrust in media, it seems like some people know that what they're seeing is not true and they don't care.
Yeah, they don't care. This is concerning. I guess we are responsible for it in part. We as journalists and we as the industry of news. When I was a child, I used to spend my mornings watching cartoons at the television. And during the advertising time, the break, journalists were on TV promoting their journalistic shows. So I created this relation with news since I was a child. In Brazil, we don't have this anymore. We don't have cartoons at television anymore. So it's hard to build new audiences today. So why or how people will believe in news if they don't have contact with the news, or if they don't have contact with the journalistic work itself? So sometimes we establish that this is all journalism fault, but there is lots of problems in Brazil. We have other cultural problems, issues like the presence of the church and how they spread misinformation in their networks are also a problem. The advertising fund for journalism is not working anymore, and this is making our journalism weakness. So we need to strengthen some collaboration between public initiatives and journalism, and we need to strengthen the local journalism to, show people how journalism is being done and how they could trust in journalism. In Brazil, local journalism has only 17% of people saying they don't believe, which means they have more credibility than the other sources of news. And I think this is very important to rebuild the trust in news, starting with the local journalism, because this sense of community is something that helps us to reestablish the value of the truth and the value of the journalism.
So, do I understand correctly, you would expect, for instance, the policymakers to strengthen structures for local journalism as a solution to have people confronted with the press?
I guess we have some individual actions that we can take as collaboration, but we need more funding, more public or governmental funding for journalism. In Brazil, we don't have any kinds of it. We have, of course, institutional, governmental journalists, but they are not supporting independent journalism yet. So I guess we need this. And as I said before, we need a regulation. Global South needs to discuss more and needs to regulate social media platforms. This change in the news consumption is one of the keys for the crisis that we are living right now.
Would you agree from your perspective, Zyma, considering that you still work in what we would call a traditional media outlet?
Actually, I'd like to add a bit more to what Nathanael was saying. Mm-hmm. When you say we need to, what you're suggesting is that we have a sort of legislation or some kind of a licensing regulation system for media to distinguish between media that is actually providing true news, real news versus others. Coming from Bangladesh, alarm bells are going off in my head immediately, because imagine something like this in Bangladesh. This would actually be used to weed out any media that is not friendly to the government. We have a law called the Cybersecurity Act. Previously, it was a law that could be used to arrest journalists, and it has been used to arrest hundreds of journalists. We've been working to reform this law for years, and the only thing we could really change about that law was that journalists cannot be arrested, but free speech is still criminalized. And so imagine giving a government that kind of authority to pick and choose what media is allowed to operate and not allowed to operate. It can be very dangerous, I think.
I mean, media regulation, of course, will depend on which government is doing the regulation. That's for sure, but it's always the discussion whether more or less. Bill, what's your take on, because we also want to delve in very briefly, at least, into the content that journalism is producing. And this was a lot about regulatory framework, which is clearly important. You seem to take a stance or advocate for journalism that takes a little bit of a stance. Why do you think that is the right approach to gain or regain trust?
Well, I don't think everyone should. I edited an opinion magazine, The Weekly Standard, for 20 years, started in 1995. On the conservative side, though I hope not entirely predictably, one of our first most controversial editorials was supporting President Clinton, actually, who we generally were opposed to since we were more on the Republican side, and the intervention here not here, but nearby, in Bosnia against Milosevic. And we lost readers, I remember, who were very disappointed that we were, so the Republicans at that point were being, some of them, irresponsible and talking about how we shouldn't do anything after the end of the Cold War, and we were on the Democrat side. I think that helped our credibility. You can be an opinion journal and an advocacy journal and still have some, I think, credibility as calling it as you see it and not simply going along with the party line. We were closed down in 2018 because our owner didn't like the fact that we were anti-Trump, and we didn't become less anti-Trump, as a lot of people on the conservative side did. And so we started the Bulwark, which is anti-Trump, but I think somewhat unpredictable. I mean, generally centrist, generally internationalist, very strongly pro-Ukraine and anti-Putin and so forth, but somewhat unpredictable and somewhat diverse, actually, in our views on some domestic policy issues, some more on the, let's say, social democratic side, some more on the kind of more neoliberal side and so forth, on economic policy. And it's been fine, but not everyone should be like us. I mean, there needs to be many different kinds of journalism. I would say one failure in the US has been, we have many very wealthy people in the US and many very wealthy foundations and institutions, and very little of that money actually has gone to support journalism. When you look at the amounts of money that go to universities, and I was a professor, so I like universities, some sort of, and I go to hospitals and art institutes and philharmonics, and that's all fine. But the amount that goes to local journalism, I would say in particular, but even to national journalism, it's not, these things tend to lose money, but they're not that expensive. And you know, people in the US could set up many, many, many local journals. They'd probably be websites now, not print journals, but that's fine. They would say, we're providing unbiased reporting on what's happening in the state capitol or in the local government. And we're providing, you know, just the transcripts of what people are saying, undoctored and video undoctored for national news. And it's funny, but it's unfortunate, I think, that just hasn't been as glamorous, or I don't know what, but, you know, civil society, I think, we have a lot of problems with, I think, former President Trump and with our institutions in general and polarization. But it is a case where our civil society, which is usually pretty good about sponsoring things outside of government, I just think has missed a real opportunity here.
Do you think, Minister Liminski, that it would be viable for a politician to say, take that as a campaign issue and say that journalism needs to be strengthened without the public thinking that there are ties there and generated interests?
I don't think it's a campaign issue, to be honest, because first of all, politicians are as liked as journalists in our country, which is a very low rate.
We rank number 2 after the politicians, I saw. Yeah.
Exactly. So we shouldn't go into an alliance to campaign. But I think it would even hurt the trustworthiness of journalism if a politician says that this is the aim of my campaign. That's the first thing. And second thing, I just want to answer to that point. Of course, this is possible in our country as we have a very well developed system of checks and balances. So, for example, it's the states which are in charge of media policy in Germany. So you always have a consensus of 16 states in order to change a treaty. And this shows that it's not as easy to change this treaty and then enforce it in a very wrong way. So, of course, it's just possible in a democracy as well developed as this, and it's not a system you can transfer to other parts of the world. But to come back to the question, I mean, to me, it's important that we have a discussion not just about the financial conditions, the technical conditions for journalism, but also about journalism itself. So, for example, you always have this debate that media focus just on the negative aspects, and there's some truth about it. Bad news are good news. There is some truth about that. And so, to me, it's important that media themselves also reflect on their work. And we have a discussion going on in Germany about that. It's about constructive media. It's about showing the solutions as well, and not just the problems. Of course, it's not politics who are in charge of claiming for this kind of journalism. It has to be a discussion by journalists, by media themselves. Then it's trustworthy, and then it will help media to get out of this low ranking of trustworthiness.
Let's hope that's how it goes. It's now time to take a look at the results of our survey. We asked you, have you lost parts of your audience or audiences to news fatigue in the last year? So 19% of you say you've lost many viewers, readers. 41% says some. 17%, only 17% assumes none, and 20% of you are unsure. I'd like to open the forum now, of course, to your questions. Please feel free to raise your hand if you would like, maybe there. A microphone will come to you shortly. Just have to wait for a few minutes. Yeah, or two. You can choose. Yes, exactly.
Oh, okay, thank you. Hi, my name is Nabia Shahid, and I'm from Pakistan. I just wanted to know that since I think many of you know that Pakistani media faces a lot of censorship, and our government keeps a very strong eye on what is being presented on the screen. My question is that in a country like Pakistan, where the government is frequently censoring what's being shown on the media, how can a journalist maintain their integrity and regain the public trust while working under these constraints?
Do you want that question to any specific panelist, or can it be anyone?
Anybody, it's okay.
Anyone wants to answer? Yeah. Yes.
You have to incrementally fight censorship. It's not going to happen all at once. It's going to take years. You can fight little bits of censorship, one at a time. And you have to really test the waters. So, for example, right before the national elections, right before people were going to vote, we knew that this is a great time for journalism because we could print a lot of courageous, brave things and not get, say, arrested or picked up. The minute the government came into power, we are choosing to lay low just a little bit, and it's something that we do for survival. Censorship it's not like a blanket censorship that exists, in the same level at all times. So you have to pick and choose your battles and see where the day goes.
We had a second question here? Or there, yeah, exactly. You were second, sorry.
Oh, okay. So, thank you very much for your enlightening narratives. That was really helpful to understand what are the challenges a journalist faces. Despite that, year after year, we are seeing in the media sphere in all over the world less independent journalists in the world, and therefore less free narratives and less truth in the media, especially in the mainstream media. So if we saw the problem from a causality perception, we would see that maybe those journalists at a certain time of their career, of their parcours, they have conveyed ideologized messages, which unfortunately must go alongside the channels and the institution to which they belong. Don't you find that this is a causal element that's made the public lose hope in journalism and media in general and look for another alternative stuff? For example, alternative media, like those people who speak without a filter, like Chomsky in his book, Manufacturing Consensus. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Do you want to throw the question to someone specifically, or can we open? It's open. Okay. I just want to point out that our experience, at least in the Latin America department, with some leaders also shows exactly that. People, when we talk about the coverage or the media, the press freedom being repressed, they say, yeah, it's the journalist's fault and it's good. So, it's good that this is happening. So would anyone like to dwell on that? Is it maybe also a little bit of our own fault?
I'm not sure exactly if this is responsive, but I would say one thing we shouldn't neglect is the internet has been a mixed blessing, but the internationalization of media, I always thought would be a good thing. Maybe it's more mixed, but I feel that I can learn much more than I could have when I was much younger, because in the old days, maybe there was one newsstand that had foreign magazines or newspapers that you could get 2 or 3 days late, from Europe or from Asia. But now, of course, you can go online and get a huge amount of material. Now you have to be selective, and some of it is disinformation, and some of it's just bad information. But I think in some ways we shouldn't glorify the past too much, and we shouldn't be maybe too down on the present. There is a lot of ability, and I think this is true even in difficult circumstances, as in Bangladesh or Brazil. I mean, there's ability to get outside information in a way that one didn't used to. People used to listen on Radio for Europe, late at night when it was getting jammed in Eastern Europe. Now, China, there are attempts, of course, to suppress this and to stop, create the walls on the internet. But I do feel like there's more available information than perhaps there once was.
You want to open?
If I may add, although I fear that not all of you like to hear that message, but there is one danger which at least you can avoid as a journalist. It's not to become an activist. There is a difference between a journalist and an activist. And the problem is that sometimes the borders are not kept correctly. And every time this happens, it gives right to those who tell stories about the media with their storytelling and their lies and so on. Every time you cross the border, you hurt journalistic rules. It always hurts journalism in general, and so it's a very high responsibility. And to me, I sometimes worry that journalists become more and more part of the game, part of the conflict. And of course, it's populist people who try to do so, who try to portray journalists as activists. But it's also wrong to fulfill this accusation by doing so. And so it's very hard to keep out of this race, to keep out of this fight, this battle, in order to keep the rules of journalism. And this, to me, is the best protection of journalism, to try to fulfill those journalistic rules to the highest point possible.
Definitely a takeaway. Thank you very much, Mr. Liminski. And those are really nice closing words for this panel. Just continue to do our job and continue to focus on the quality of our job. That's what we're also here for. I want to thank all of you, Zyma, Natália, Bill, and Mr. Liminski, for your time and for your valuable impressions. To you for making it to the end of day one of the Global Media Forum, but I have one more intervention by my wonderful colleague Liz Show for today. Thank you very much, and a big applause, of course.
Thank you very much, Javier, and thank you to your wonderful panel.